Hey, thank you, Jerry. So this is the second lecture in the series, Where Are We Headed? Perspectives on the Second Trump Presidency. Last week, the presentation focused on foreign policy, and tonight we're going to look at immigration. Now, the Statue of Liberty is perhaps America's most endearing, treasured symbol. It represents freedom, democracy, hope for a better life for those arriving on these shores. It has often been said that the United States is a nation of immigrants, that the only true Americans are Native Americans. Nobel Prizes have been awarded to 142 immigrants to the United States. Nearly half of the companies in the Fortune 500 were founded by immigrants or their children. Products that were so familiar.
Speak a little louder, Don, just a drop louder. Thank you.
Products that we're so familiar with, such as blue jeans, Tesla, God Bless America, the song, all the products of immigrants. But President Donald Trump added a punitive anti-immigration policy during his first 4 years as president. And he is convinced that it was immigration, not the economy, that was responsible for his re-election this past November. On his first full day in his second term as president, that would be on Tuesday, he signed 6 executive orders aimed at curtailing, if not completely eliminating, immigration to the United States. Now, when he was first president back in 2017, Democrats fought against his crackdown on immigration at almost every turn. But the approach on the part of Democrats this time might be very different. So, for example, today, Congress passed the Laken-Riley Act. Laken-Riley was a student, I believe, in Georgia, and she was unfortunately murdered by an undocumented immigrant from Venezuela. And the Laken-Riley Act that was passed today makes it easier for authorities to detain and deport undocumented migrants who are charged with shoplifting or assaulting a police officer or causing bodily harm to another person. Now, 46 Democrats in the House of Representatives voted, along with all Republicans, in favor of the Laken-Riley Act, and 12 Democrats in the Senate also supported the bill. Now, critics argue that this law bypasses due process because a person won't have to be convicted of a crime in order to be detained or deported. The law says that authorities can detain and deport undocumented migrants who are simply charged with shoplifting or other crimes. And so clearly this law is aimed at a segment of the immigrant population. But anti-immigrant sentiment that certainly is shared by Donald Trump and many other Americans is nothing new in American history. Those who oppose increased immigration argue that many immigrants bring crime and disease, that they go on welfare, that they receive food stamps, that they impose burdens on health services and public schools, and therefore immigrants increase cost to taxpayers. Other arguments are that immigrants take jobs away from native-born Americans, that they're responsible for crime, that many of them fail to learn English, they don't want to abandon their old ways, and therefore they threaten to change the cultural identity of the United States. Those who defend immigration argue that immigrants are less likely to commit crime than those born in the United States, that immigrants are truly exceptional individuals. When you look at the historical record, we see that immigration is real is a rare response to hardship back in the home country. In fact, no matter how bad conditions are, most people reject immigration as an option, even when faced with civil war, famine, invasion, or natural disaster. Most people stay put. They hope to ride out difficult times. And so, for example, during the Great Potato Famine in Ireland in 1845, only 1 in 7 chose to emigrate. Another example, despite anti Semitic violence in Tsarist Russia, most Jews stayed, hoping and praying that things would get better. So to immigrate is to leave behind everything familiar, to risk a new life in a strange and possibly hostile new homeland. And so immigrants are really not the typical citizens of their homeland. Rather, immigrants are bold risk takers who are motivated to work hard to succeed in their adopted country rather than coming to seek welfare benefits, according to those who defend immigration. In fact, it's been argued that the famous poem that's inscribed on the Statue of Liberty actually mischaracterizes those who leave their home countries behind. They are not the tired and the poor. Rather, they are people possessed of determination, skill, resources to seek a better life. So, in this lecture on immigration, um, we're going to take a look at Trump's immigration policy during his second term in office. But as I stated last week, history remains the best guide to predicting the future because past events establish patterns and precedents that are repeated in later years. So let's begin by examining immigration policies was expressed by some of the founding fathers. In the middle of the 18th century, Ben Franklin and other English speaking Pennsylvanians expressed fear that German immigrants speaking the German language would take over. And so, as early as 1751, Franklin decried the impact on the colony of Pennsylvania. Franklin said, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so German?" Pennsylvania's colonial assembly even passed a bill prohibiting all foreign immigration, but that bill was vetoed by the governor. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, complained that immigrants, this incoherent, distracted mass. And that was when the total population was only 2 million, 80% of whom came from the British Isles. As early as colonial times, the most suspect of all immigrants were Catholics. Many Protestants in early America were convinced that Catholics could not maintain their allegiance to the United States while they had allegiance to the Pope. Now, following independence, Congress in 1790 passed one of the world's most liberal naturalization laws. The 1790 law required only 2 years of residence, and it limited citizenship to free white people who resided in the country for at least 2 years, were of good character, and who swore allegiance to the Constitution. And so this naturalization law excluded Native Americans, Blacks, and Asians from becoming citizens. In the first half of the 19th century, 2 million immigrants came from Ireland and 1.5 million from Germany. So here's a a graph that shows the spike in Irish immigration to the United States occurring in the mid 1840s during the potato famine. And so, as you can see, huge numbers of Irish emigrated to the United States, but it still represented just 1 out of 7 in Ireland. Nevertheless, by 1850, New York City was more than 1/3 Irish.
Wow.
I think somebody's microphone is still on. So, Jerry, could you? Okay, so New York City was 1/3 Irish. In Boston, from 1845 to 1855, the Irish-born population increased from 2% to 20%. Now, most German and Irish immigrants were Catholic, and so anti-Catholic feeling rose in a predominantly Protestant United States. Some established Americans were horrified to see shiploads of immigrants, sometimes bringing in epidemic diseases. Many immigrants arrived with limited skills and were poorly educated. They were crammed into filthy, overcrowded housing. And some immigrants did not seem to practice the Yankee virtue of thrift, self-denial, and sobriety. And so many American Protestants feared that Catholic immigrants would be, as I said, more loyal to the Pope than to the United States. And they resented the rise of Catholic parochial schools in America. Protestant antagonism towards Catholic immigrants erupted in several American cities in the 1830s and 1840s. The worst anti-immigrant riot occurred in Philadelphia, which is, by the way, known as the city of brotherly love. But as you can see from this woodcut, this was an attack on the Irish in Philadelphia. Protestant workers fought against Irish Catholic workers, and 20 people died. And all of this led to the rise of the first anti-immigrant political party in America. It was called the Know Nothing Party, which derived its name from the secrecy of its members. If its members were asked about the nature of the party, they were supposed to say, "I know nothing." But the party was a nativist party. It wanted to limit immigration to the United States and change laws so that an immigrant could only become a citizen after living in the United States 25 years. And this party attracted working men and women who feared that foreign immigration would threaten their jobs. The party was popular in the 1850s, but when the Civil War broke out, the party faded away. Now, the California gold rush of 1849 brought tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants who then competed with white workers for low-paying jobs. Chinese immigrants could not become citizens because of the 1790 federal law, and labor unions petitioned Congress to expel Chinese immigrants because they were willing to work for lower wages than native-born workers. And so in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusionary Act, making it unlawful for Chinese laborers to enter the United States. This is the first act in American history to limit immigration. Between 1880 and 1924, 20 million Europeans came to the United States. So as you can see from this chart, there was a tremendous spike in immigration between 1880 and 1924. I would imagine that many of your ancestors came to the United States during this particular period, because many of the immigrants came from Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe. It was referred to as American fever that brought immigrants from these parts of Europe. Now, up until the 1880s, most immigrants to the United States came from the British Isles or from Western Europe or Northern Europe, Scandinavia. But in this wave of immigration between 1880 and 1924, immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe where they had never come before. And that aroused fears and anxiety among some native born Americans. They looked upon these Southern and Eastern European immigrants as aliens. Their cultures, languages, and religions seemed particularly foreign, too different for them to ever become true Americans, they said. Jews, especially, seemed threatening to Americans who thought of their country as a Christian nation. Eastern Europeans seemed helpless and ill fitting to many Americans. They were uh, much less educated than earlier immigrants, and by and large, they were poorer than previous immigrants. And all of this coincided with the emergence of the so called science of eugenics, which claimed that there was a hierarchy of races, that at the very top were the Nordic people of Northern Europe. They were the superior race. And at the very bottom were the darker Mediterranean peoples of Southern Europe and people from Eastern Europe. These recent immigrants from Eastern Europe were depicted as, quote, beaten men from beaten races, representing the worst failures in the struggle for existence. That was the conclusion of eugenicists about immigrants coming between 1880 and 1924. But not everybody felt that way. Emma Lazarus wrote a sonnet to welcome the oppressed and displaced. And you're familiar with the New Colossus, the poem that said, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And this is now at the base of the Statue of Liberty. But at the same time, the editor of the Atlantic Monthly wrote a poem entitled Unguarded Gates. And this poem said, wide open and unguarded stand our gates, and through them presses a wild motley throng, those tiger passions here to stretch their claws in streets and alleys whose strange tongues and accents of menace are alien to our air, voices that once the Tower of Babel knew. So look at these two poems, and that it encapsulates the ambivalence that Americans have felt historically about immigrants. Now, following World War I, after the Russian Revolution, there was fear that Bolshevism would spread to the United States. And that led to the first Red Scare in American history. And after World War I, there was a widespread sense that immigrants were bringing Bolshevik ideas to America, that these radical ideologies that immigrants brought with them threatened to destroy the United States. And as a result, many Americans began to suspect the loyalty of so-called hyphenated Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, and they began to call for restrictions against immigration. Now, since its founding days, the United States had open borders. America welcomed people across the world to build their lives here. But in 1924, nativism reemerged, and Congress passed the Immigration Quota Act. And this was a law that restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and favored immigrants from Western Europe. And at the time, this law was widely hailed for its, quote, biological wisdom. Again, because there was a widespread assumption that immigrants from Western Europe were racially superior to the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this immigration law of 1924 would not be revised until 1965. And it had a particularly tragic consequence when European Jews in the 1930s and 40s were desperate to flee from Nazi controlled nations, yet they were denied entry to the United States because of the quotas established by this 1924 act. Now, immigration to the United States dropped sharply during the Great Depression. As you can see from this chart, this is the period from 1931 to 1940. By 1942, with young American men off to war, the Bracero program was introduced to bring millions of Mexican farm workers to work on American farms during the war. And this program gave temporary work permits. But many of the 4.8 million Mexicans under this program were supposed to return to Mexico, but they didn't. Instead, they stayed in the United States. And so between 1954 and 1964, the Immigration and Naturalization Services deported millions of undocumented Mexican immigrants in a program which was called Operation Wetback. Clearly, that was before political correctness. Now, the Cold War led the United States to open its doors to refugees from the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, from Cuba after Castro took over, and to refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia during the 1970s, and to Jews from the Soviet Union coming to the United States in the 1970s. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished the 1924 quotas. It created the foundation for today's immigration law. It leveled the immigration playing field. It gave nearly an equal shot to newcomers from every corner of the world. And it changed the face of America by opening doors to immigrants from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It also led to an unanticipated flood of migrants as a result of something called chain migration, in which anyone in the United States who was a citizen or held a green card could sponsor family members to come. And that led to a dramatic increase in the foreign-born population. And so if we look at this chart, we could see that the percentage of Americans who are foreign-born in 1965, when this law was passed, was about 5%, whereas today, some 15.5% of the population in the United States is foreign-born. So that is the result of this 1965 immigration law. Now, undocumented or unauthorized immigration also grew considerably after the passage of the 1965 Act, and Congress has been wrestling with the problem ever since. During the Reagan administration, a blanket amnesty was granted for 3 million undocumented aliens. Reagan famously said, "I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally." And when you read that quote and compare where the Republican Party stands today on immigration, it is truly surprising. In 1994, another act provided amnesty for an additional 500,000 undocumented aliens. But it was also in 1994 that California voters approved Proposition 187, which denied illegal immigrants and their children access to education, welfare, and most health services. But a federal judge struck down Prop 187 on the ground that control of immigration policy rests with the federal government, not with the states, and therefore California did not have the right to legislate about immigrants. Then in 1997, a law gave amnesty to 1 million undocumented aliens from Central America. Now, the 8 years of President George W. Bush's administration saw a marked increase in illegal immigration and a drop in immigration enforcement through much of his tenure. So we see this chart of estimates of the undocumented immigrant population in the United States. During the Bush administration, some 12.2 million undocumented aliens were living in the United States. Bush repeatedly pushed for amnesty. He argued that undocumented immigrants are doing jobs that Americans refuse to do. Nevertheless, in 2006, Congress authorized the construction of a fence along the US-Mexican border. Well, after George W. Bush, Obama came into office, and in June of 2012, President Obama unilaterally instituted the DREAM Act, the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. And what this did was it granted temporary conditions of residency to the children of undocumented immigrants, giving them the right to work, and that they could obtain permanent residency under certain conditions. They have to have attended at least a 2-year college. They have to have high moral character. And to date, more than 800,000 undocumented youths have been accepted into this DACA program, which became known as the DREAM Act. Now, while Obama vigorously pushed for immigration reform, his administration deported more people than any previous presidential administration. So if we look at this bar graph, we can see the numbers of illegal aliens removed by George H.W. Bush, by Bill Clinton, by George W. Bush, and by Barack Obama. And so, because of this, Obama earned the title Deporter in Chief. By 2016, migration from Mexico began to ease off, but there were increasing numbers of Central American immigrants coming to the southern border seeking asylum. Now, US law provides that anyone who claims asylum is entitled to a hearing before an immigration judge and cannot be deported. And many of these migrants from Central America were fleeing crime in their homelands. And because of their dire circumstances, they applied for asylum in the United States. Now, some 40% of the claims that went through the system were approved. But because of immigration court backlogs, the process often took several years. And in 2016, the United States had what was called the Catch and Release Program, whereby asylum seekers were allowed to live and work in the United States until their case could be heard. Now, the lack of funding for US immigration courts to handle these claims created a magnet that drew more and more people to the southern border. People felt, well, you can apply for asylum, then you would get into the United States, and because of catch and release, you can live and work in the United States until your case was heard. And so, with more and more people coming in, the backlog mushroomed from 500,000 cases in 2016 to 3.5 million just last year. Now we turn to Donald Trump and his first term as president. He staked his 2016 primary campaign on an unwavering hardline position on immigration. You may remember that he announced his candidacy in 2015 when he stated, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people." Well, his immigration policy called for mass deportations, as well as a temporary ban on Muslim immigration and a border wall that Trump said would be paid for by Mexico. Trump's appeal to nativism and xenophobia clearly echoed back to the 1924 immigration law. Trump framed the situation at the southern border as a national emergency. He cited terrorism concerns as a reason for stricter vetting procedures for immigrants, particularly those coming from majority Muslim countries. One of Trump's earliest executive orders was a travel ban that targeted several predominantly Muslim countries, which was later expanded to include other nations. Now, at first, the Supreme Court struck down the Muslim ban, but it was reconstituted, and then it became part of immigration law. Now, one of Trump's most significant and controversial promises in the 2016 election was to build a border wall along the US Mexican border to prevent illegal immigration. Now, the construction of the wall began in 2006, but that wall was very limited. Trump promised to build a border wall to seal off the entire border between Mexico and the United States. And he said that Mexico would pay for the construction of the wall. Now, a complete wall was never built. His administration constructed about 500 miles of new barriers. And it goes without saying, the Mexican government did not pay for the construction. Trump adopted a zero tolerance policy that led to the separation of families at the southern border. This family separation policy separated some 6,000 parents and children. Children were literally wrenched from their parents' arms. And when adults were prosecuted for illegal entry, their children were also taken into custody. And conditions in detention centers, particularly for children, became a significant point of contention, with accusations of overcrowding and inhumane treatment. And so the policy was widely criticized, and Trump eventually reversed it, but it still resulted in a long-lasting impact on immigrants. Many of those families were never reconnected. Trump also introduced a procedure called Title 42, which denied entry to asylum seekers under the justification of the COVID-19 pandemic. So even though asylum seekers are entitled to petition for asylum, that was suspended under Title 42. Trump also adopted a Remain in Mexico policy that required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for their hearings rather than being allowed to stay in the United States while their claims were being processed. So the Remain in Mexico policy was geared to eliminate the catch and release program. During his first term, Trump called for the electrification of a border wall. He also suggested adding spikes on top of the wall, spikes that could pierce human flesh. And he recommended a water-filled trench stocked with snakes and alligators. Now, whether he was serious about that or not, we don't know, but I think we get the point. Trump also reportedly suggested to aides that officials should shoot migrants in the legs. But many officials refused to implement some of Trump's most extreme plans. And in addition, lawsuits stopped many Trump administration policies, including policies that aim to separate families at the border, uh, the arbitrary cutting off of access to asylum, um, and Trump had uh, tried to mandate a citizenship question on the census form in order to dissuade uh, immigrants um, from voting. Well, the court struck down the citizenship question on the census. Um, Trump also attempted to prevent abortion access for unaccompanied immigrant minors. Um, Even Trump appointed judges found many of Trump's policies uh, unlawful. Now, Trump's administration sharply reduced the number of refugees allowed to come into the United States. The number of refugees were capped at a historically low level, often below 20,000 in some years, and that is down from an average of 95,000 during the Obama administration. Trump also tried to end the DACA Dream Act program, but the Supreme Court in 2020 ruled that his attempt to rescind DACA was unconstitutional. Now, since President Biden was elected in 2020, he implemented a number of significant changes to U.S. immigration policy, focusing on restoring asylum procedures and undoing many of Trump's restrictive measures. But Biden's policies also face challenges, both from within the United States and abroad. One of Biden's first actions as president was to remove the Muslim ban and to put an immediate halt to the construction of the US Mexico border wall. Biden signed an executive order directing the Department of Homeland Security to strengthen and preserve the DACA program. Biden extended temporary protection to citizens of countries that are affected by war. Temporary protection status was extended to Haitians because of the horrible conditions in Haiti. And those Haitians, as you know, settled in, among other places, in parts of Ohio and were accused of eating pets during the most recent election cycle. And so citizens from countries affected by war or natural disasters or other crises can come into the United States as temporary protected citizens or immigrants. Biden also worked on reuniting families that were separated under Trump's zero tolerance policy. But despite those efforts, some families still remain separated. Biden signed an executive order raising the refugee admission cap. But his administration faced significant challenges as the number of border crossings increased dramatically in 2021 and 2022. So if we look at this chart here, we see the number of migrants coming in. And as you can see, there was a real spike after Biden took office. Some of the highest levels of migrants coming into the United States occurred from 2021 to 2022. And that left many people to believe that the southern border was out of control. And as the number of migrant encounters surged under the Biden administration, immigration became a top issue for voters in the 2024 election. Immigration was second only to concerns over inflation and the economy. This past February, the Senate came up with a bipartisan bill that provided for more enforcement at the southern border. But you may remember Trump pressured Republicans in Congress to vote against it because Trump didn't want the Biden administration to get credit for any immigration reform. Now, had that bill passed, that would have eased the crisis at the southern border. Trump made immigration a major focus of his campaign in the 2024 election. He placed blame on Kamala Harris for the issues at the southern border. He referred to her as the border czar. Now, to be clear, Vice President Harris was never the border czar. She was asked to go to Central America to see what could be done to dissuade Central Americans from coming to the southern border. Trump promised to complete the construction of the border wall and to redirect federal law enforcement agents to immigration enforcement. He said he would carry out the largest deportation operation in American history. In his campaigning in 2024, Trump escalated his anti-immigrant demagoguery, saying, for example, referring to immigrants, they're poisoning the blood of our country. And he also said, they're rough people, in many cases from jails, prisons, from mental institutions, insane asylums. You know, insane asylums, that Silence of the Lambs stuff. And the Democrats say, please don't call them animals. They're humans. I said, no, they're not humans. They're not humans, they're animals. Well, most political observers have concluded that Trump's victory in November was largely the result of widespread concern over inflation and illegal immigration. Now, Trump has promised to be even more aggressive towards immigrants in his second term. In November of 2023, his close advisor, Stephen Miller, told the New York Times, Trump will unleash the vast arsenal of federal powers to implement the most spectacular migration crackdown. And when Trump became president for his second term, he appointed Stephen Miller as his deputy chief of staff for policy and homeland security. That's a role in which Miller is expected to engineer Trump's overhaul of immigration policy and to militarize mass deportations. Trump characterized migrants as a threat to national security and a threat to public safety. He said, once again, he would launch the largest mass deportation program in American history. Now, to get a sense of where Trump's immigration policy is headed, Project 2025 was written by former Trump senior officials, and it offered a blueprint for Trump's policy on immigration over the next 4 years. Project 2025 calls for allowing Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or known as ICE, to use expedited removal against immigrants found anywhere within the country. It would allow raids in sensitive zones such as schools, hospitals, and religious institutions. Project 2025 called for the militarization of the border in order to prevent illegal crossings and an increase in wall construction, as well as higher hurdles for asylum seekers. It calls for expanding immigration detention centers so that up to 100,000 people facing deportation could be detained in these centers. Project 2025 demanded an end to protections for more than the 500,000 Dreamers who arrived here as children. It called on Congress to repeal the temporary protected status designation, which would cause nearly 700,000 immigrants, many of whom have been living and working in the United States for decades, to lose their work authorization and face deportation. It would also cut back or eliminate numerous categories of temporary and permanent visas. Project 2025 calls for the expansion of state and local police to be involved in the enforcement of federal immigration laws. And it calls for penalizing states and localities that don't fully cooperate with federal immigration authorities. Now, during the campaign, Trump was pressed about this, and he said he disagreed with Project 2025. But then on December 13th, he called parts of the Project 2025 policy agenda, quote, very conservative and very good. Now, while he insists he had nothing to do with this blueprint, he proceeded to invite some of its key architects to serve in his second administration. And on his first few days in office, he signed executive orders to implement much of what is contained in Project 2025. Now, in his inaugural speech this past Monday, Trump reiterated his pledge to carry out mass deportations. He said, I will declare a national emergency at our southern border. All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places in which they came. Trump also said he would reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy, which forced 70,000 asylum seekers during his first term to wait in Mexico for hearings in U.S. immigration courts. Trump also pledged to use the 1798 Alien Enemies Act to pressure state and local police to arrest and help deport foreign-born people in the United States who are here illegally. And just hours after taking the oath of office on Monday, Trump issued a flurry of executive orders to implement the immigration laws recommended in Project 2025. And so, one executive order declared a national emergency at the border, proclaiming that, quote, the current situation at the southern border qualifies as an invasion under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution of the United States. This executive order allows the president to send the military and National Guard to the border. And just yesterday, he sent 1,500 troops to join the 2,500 National Guard soldiers already at the southern border. The declaration of a national emergency will free up military funding to build more sections of the border wall and to support operations to stop border crossings. He said he is sending troops to the southern border to, quote, repel the disastrous invasion of our country. Another executive order that he issued ended birthright citizenship, a right that is contained in the 14th Amendment. He also issued an order to utilize in-depth vetting and screening of all individuals seeking admission to or already present in the United States, particularly for individuals from regions or nations with identified national security risk. Another executive order suspended the entry of refugees into the United States. And another order set border enforcement policies that include the establishment of a physical wall and other barriers at U.S. borders, the pursuing of criminal charges against undocumented migrants, an end to the catch and release program, enticing federal-state partnerships to enforce these immigration policies. And Trump also shut down the CPB-1 app, which Biden had created to allow immigrants to schedule appointments at points of entry along the U.S.-Mexican border. Trump is also raising the possibility of invoking a Wartime Power Act for the first time since World War II in order to deport gang members who are deemed members of a foreign terrorist organization. Trump's new policies would allow ICE to conduct enforcement actions in or near sensitive areas like schools and churches, places that under the Biden administration would have required more steps before authorities could initiate arrests. Finally, Trump plans to challenge the so-called sanctuary city laws, by ordering the Justice Department to investigate local law enforcement officials if they refuse to enforce these new immigration policies. He also wants to end federal grants to those sanctuary jurisdictions. And so, with these executive orders, the incoming president hopes to send the message that the border is closed to illegal crossings, that anyone living in the United States unauthorized, especially those who have committed crimes, will be deported. Now, this ambitious immigration agenda will no doubt face a number of legal and logistical hurdles. As mentioned earlier, Congress today passed the Lincoln-Riley Act that would lower the bar for um, um, any undocumented immigrant who committed crimes such as theft or assault against law enforcement. Now, that is the first immigration law that Trump will sign in his second term, but it might be very difficult to enforce. An internal memo from ICE said that ICE would need $26 billion in just the first year to house those undocumented immigrants that will be detained. Now, Trump has threatened to invoke the Alien Enemies Act to target undocumented migrant gang members for arrest and deportation. The Alien Enemies Act is a 1798 law which allows the president to detain, relocate, or deport non-citizens from a country considered an enemy of the United States during wartime. It has been invoked only 3 times in American history, and it has not been invoked since World War I. It was invoked back in 1798 and during World War I and World War II. Now, the fine print of this act says the president can only take on this authority once Congress has declared war. Now, although Trump has repeatedly referred to the influx of migrants as an invasion, he hasn't blamed a specific country or a conflict that would fall within the scope of this 1798 Act. Now, the American Civil Liberties Union, various civil rights and immigration rights groups, along with the attorney generals of 22 states, immediately sued the Trump administration on Monday over his attempt to end birthright citizenship. And today, a federal judge in Seattle blocked Trump's executive order challenging birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship in a case back in 1898, and many constitutional experts think the courts will do the same again. Nevertheless, while legal scholars have expressed skepticism about the legality of Trump's executive order, the lawsuit could end up before the Supreme Court. And with 6 conservative members, well, anything is possible. Another major obstacle to Trump's plan to deport 11 million undocumented immigrants has to do with the cost of the roundup, of detention, of deportation. And that cost has been put at $315 billion by the American Immigrant Council. Critics argue that there's no way to do mass deportation the way Trump officials are talking about. They say the more you force agencies to increase the total numbers of immigrants to be deported, that pushes them to the lowest hanging fruit on the immigration system. And that means not the hardened criminals. Criminals and gang members will be hard to locate. And so many of those who will be rounded up will be people who show up for work every day to support their families. In addition, it's unclear what the incoming administration will do with people from countries that don't want to take their citizens back, countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela. Finally, immigration threatens to split the Trump administration. A major source of contention centers around the H-1B visa program that enables employers to bring skilled workers to the United States. And MAGA supporters such as Laura Loomer and Steve Bannon charge that immigrants who come in under the H-1B visa program take jobs away from American workers. On the other hand, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy argue that America's tech industry must recruit foreign engineers and computer experts in order to remain competitive. And so there's a big fight going on between MAGA supporters and these tech bros, as they're called. Now, in the past, Trump had criticized the H-1B program, but now he seems to be siding with Musk over the issue. And that fracture within Trump world might upset the agenda of the incoming administration on a number of policies. So, in conclusion, the United States has more immigrants than any other country in the world. Today, some 47.8 million people living in the United States were born in another country. Now, this chart says it's more like 51.4 million. And that accounts for about 20% of all the migrants in the world. The population of immigrants is also very diverse in America. Just about every country in the world is represented among US immigrants. And immigrants today account for 15.5% of the total US population. That's nearly triple the share back in 1970, when only 4.7% of the population was foreign born. The last comprehensive immigration reform was enacted almost 4 decades ago during the Reagan presidency. And so clearly, there's a need for immigration reform today. And as I said, Americans have always been ambivalent about immigration, and that ambivalence continues today. Anti-immigrant sentiment becomes politically popular in times of economic crisis. And that's why the struggling working class in America today finds Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric so appealing. But the United States is hardly the only country with a streak of anti-immigration nativism and xenophobia. However, we are the only nation founded on the principles of equality and opportunity. And that in the past, we have been a safe haven for the oppressed. In fact, there's a good argument to increase immigration to the United States. Argument number one: immigrants and unauthorized immigrants pay billions of dollars each year in taxes, and they would earn more and therefore pay more in taxes if they had some kind of legal status. Immigrants raise the gross domestic product. Immigrants reduce the federal deficit and increase consumer buying power. And as our population ages and our birth rates decline, we will require more, not less, immigration for economic growth and stability. We need immigrants to help pay for the Social Security of Americans who will be retiring. Now, statistically, it is proven that immigrants coming to the United States will earn more than native-born Americans. Immigrants will marry at higher rates and divorce at lower rates. They will achieve graduate or professional degrees at a higher rate than native-born Americans. They will fall out of the workforce less frequently than native-born Americans. And they will be less likely to commit crimes compared with native-born Americans. And finally, one last reason for increasing immigration: immigrant labor is going to be needed in Los Angeles if these homes are ever going to be rebuilt because of the recent fires. So, right on time, that completes the second lecture in the series on Where Are We Headed?